Just want to separate the issue of funding for prisons and actually the incompetence of the staff at this prison. Yes, I think we can all agree there probably needs to be some extra funding going into prisons, not least for the infrastructure, which is ageing. A lot of it is Victorian.
And it's time now to discuss some of the day's big stories with our panellists this evening. Delighted to be joined by the political commentator, Albie Amankona. Evening, Albie.
Good evening.
And also the broadcaster and columnist, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown. Evening, Yasmin.
Hello there.
And don't forget, you can have your say on any of the stories we're discussing. You can text us 87222. Start your message, please, with the word Times. You can tweet us at Times Radio, or you can drop me a message on WhatsApp. 0333 003 2353 is the number. Well, let's get straight to it and begin with a brilliant investigation by The Times. Paul Morgan Bentley, who's head of investigations at the paper, has been working undercover at HMP Bedford to investigate the state of our failing prison system. Morgan Bentley was hired as a temporary OSG escort with little background checks and found a shocking series of security lapses. Ian Atchison, former head of security at Wandsworth Prison, gave me his reaction earlier.
It's an extremely troubling and alarming report, and if it weren't for good investigative journalism like this, we'd be none the wiser about what I think is a fairly serious and widespread system-wide security failure, which is common to many prisons.
Evening to Jay on the text. He says, it's not like you couldn't see this coming. It was a stupid thing to do, getting rid of experienced professionals to save money, and they've done it with everything right across the board. Yasmin, I mean, there have been issues in prisons in this country for decades, but is this the worst it's ever been?
I certainly think it's the worst it's ever been, but then I could use that sentence about almost anything else at the moment in our public services. You know, schools are the worst they've ever been in terms of facilities and so on. But this is the worst. And whoever it was who said it was the cost cutting and cutting of professional staff. But there's also something, I think it's a brilliant report. I've read it. You know, the whole thing about prison is a balancing act. We have to remember, in the end, these are human beings. And the system, if it does this to them, there will be some who are truly evil, some who are not. But as if the system is like this, lax, unprofessional. From this report, it said, you know, there was sewage in some bits of the prison, blah, blah, blah. You just turn human beings into animals, and that doesn't help anything. So it's bad on every front, really.
Albie, where do you come down on this? Because Michael Howard, former Conservative Home Secretary, famously said prison works. A lot of people on the centre-right would agree with that sentiment. But if you are going to have a large prison population, it's going to be expensive. You're going to have to fund the prison service properly.
Yes, look, prison funding is never something which is going to attract voters at the ballot box. And that's why time and time again, governments, whether or not they're Labour or Conservative, never really prioritise public spending on prisons because it's not exactly a vote winner. But I just want to separate the issue of funding for prisons and actually the incompetence of the staff at this prison. Yes, I think we can all agree there probably needs to be some extra funding going into prisons, not least for the infrastructure, which is ageing. A lot of it is Victorian. But on the issue of the people who are in charge of this particular prison, HMP Bedford, it just seems like widespread incompetence. Keys being given to staff without proper vetting not being done. So a Times journalist, where it's quite easy to figure out that this man, Paul Morgan Bentley, was a Times journalist, head of investigations at the Times. No one in the prison HR system thought to have a little search and see who this guy was before he was given essentially free rein within a prison. You know, this investigative journalist was talking about the fact that he could have taken anything into the prison: weapons, drugs, that people were smoking drugs in the prisons, and there didn't really seem to be any sort of penalty or punishment whatsoever. So yes, we can agree that there needs to be more funding into prison infrastructure, but there's something that's seriously gone wrong with the staff of this prison for them to behave in such an incompetent way as to let a fantastic Times journalist in and report on this awful story.
Well, isn't it just, Albie, that there aren't enough of these staff? And even when these security checks did happen, Paul Morgan Bentley describes it being done often by staff who weren't fully trained on the security scanners. They didn't fully know what they're doing. And I mean, when I was speaking to Ian Atchison, a former prison governor earlier, I was really struck by one of the quotes he came out with. I wrote it down, in fact. He said, "It's a fact of life that you will have some corrupt prison staff." And the fact that we just accept that seems ridiculous. But as he described, the amount of money that they're paid, some of these young prison officers, and very often they are very young prison officers these days, is so low, you can make the same money flipping burgers in McDonald's. Not that there's anything wrong with doing that, but you'd probably have a far less stressful life than working in a very, very tough environment like one of our modern day prisons. And as a result, that's probably why you get corruption sometimes, because, these low paid prison officers are open to bribes.
Well, look, my cousin, who I'm seeing at the weekend for Easter, is a prison officer, and the majority of prison officers are not corrupt. They do a very difficult job in very tough circumstances. And of course, there are a few bad apples in every apple tree. But in this particular prison, HMP Bedford, it just seems like a whole tree of bad apples. And you just wonder why it is that we had that situation at Wandsworth Prison. I think it was a couple of months ago now, where we had Daniel Khalife escape, and everyone was wondering, well, how on earth did this happen? Well, this is how it happens: wide-scale incompetence at our prisons.
I still think that we haven't addressed the main cause, which is overcrowding. We have more people in prison now than ever before. And, there was a time, I mean, not all prisons are the same. I've been into Brixton Prison, and actually the security is terrifying. I was going to this restaurant they have there, Clink, where prisoners work in the restaurants. They cook and they serve, and it's a wonderful place. But it takes almost an hour and 10, 15 minutes to get in. So it's not all prisons. But it's also, the Michael Howard thing you said, it reminded me of something. I once went to a prison, and I'm not even sure it wasn't Bedford, because some readers wanted to speak to me, who were readers of the newspaper I was working for. And Michael Howard had been into this prison 2 weeks earlier and ordered all the plants that the prisoners had been growing in little old tin cans to be killed, because that was too much joy. Well, you can't do that to prisoners and to prisons. I mean, way back in the Victorian times, Elizabeth Fry was a great prison reformer. So it's a security issue, and I do agree with Albie that, it's a shocker that so many prisons are, but the overcrowding, lack of expenditure, and not treating the good prisoners right is a complex set of issues.
Politically, though, Yasmin, it's incredibly difficult for both the Conservatives and Labour, because if you're going to fix the prisons fully, OK, you could have fewer people going to prison, but you've still got to spend a lot of money. If you're going to upgrade Britain's creaking, largely Victorian prison infrastructure, that's incredibly expensive. And at a time when there are so many pressures on the public purse, and potentially an incoming Labour government is going to have to choose whether you're going to spend more on the NHS, whether you're going to spend more on defence, education, etc. For most voters who never go into a prison, it's very low down their list of priorities.
Yeah, but it's not about the buildings and things. That does, sewage should not be swilling around anywhere, in a prison or anywhere. But I think it's the people's problem. If you get good, highly trained, committed professionals, which our prison service does often have, that can change the atmosphere from being a high security, tense, to a relation. I've seen fantastic relationships, good relationships between prison officers and young prisoners in particular, who've gone on to education, done things with their lives. We can't, we'd be, if these were little lambs or cattle or dogs, we would care a lot. So I'm not being bleeding heart about it. In the long run, doing the right thing for prisoners pays off.
Albie Amankona, political commentator, and broadcaster and columnist Yasmin Alibhai-Brown are with us on Times Radio on the evening edition, discussing the day's big stories. Let's move on to Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, who have written for The Times tonight. You can read it right now with your digital subscription. It's going to be in the paper tomorrow. Keir Starmer has praised Boris Johnson's vision of levelling up Britain and accused Rishi Sunak of killing off the flagship policy. The Labour leader will launch his party's local election campaign tomorrow by pledging to tackle the, and I quote, alienation and powerlessness across much of Britain. This is very interesting, Albie, because first you had Rachel Reeves praising Margaret Thatcher a couple of weeks ago. Now you've got Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer praising one of Boris Johnson's flagship policies. I mean, they're almost being a bit mischievous, but I suppose the message is, look, if you voted for Boris Johnson in 2019, you are welcome to vote Labour now.
Well, I think it's quite fun. I couldn't help but have a little chuckle when I was reading this article, James, because who in principle doesn't disagree with levelling up, sorting out regional inequality in this country, spreading opportunity around the country, and all of those things? Everyone agrees with all of those things. It's one of the reasons why the levelling up policy in the 2019 electoral coalition was so successful. Now, Boris and the Conservative government were blown off course by the COVID pandemic, then blown off course by what happened in Ukraine, then blown off course by Partygate. He was never actually able to deliver on his flagship policy. But I think this whole argument that Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner are making in this article that Rishi Sunak has hamstrung levelling up is total nonsense. You know, levelling up has been backed by over £48 billion of government funding, also funding from businesses, both large and small. There's a Network North integrated transport plan, which is replacing the northern legs of HS2, even though I disagree with that personal policy. I think we should have carried on building HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail. But that's happened. I think the idea that Rishi Sunak is the man who has ended levelling up is total nonsense. And I also find it interesting some of the language that they're using with some of the bills that they want to bring through, the Take Back Control bill. They want to spread devolution across the country. Well, the Tories have already done that. So on the Labour Party's levelling up policy, it's not exactly clear what they would be doing. That would be totally different from the Conservatives anyway.
It's a really good point. Just to pick up on that, Yasmin, how do you achieve levelling up in practice? If Labour say, OK, more devolution, that's fine. But as Albie points out, there's been a lot of devolution in recent years anyway. So how do you actually get it to work?
Well, I think it's astounding and astoundingly illiterate of Starmer and Rayner to frame this in the way they have done. Levelling up is absolutely important. But what happened, what Boris did was, you know, when he won them over in the 2019 election, he promised them that leaving Europe would release all this money, which was fake, complete fake promise, would then swish its way up to these places which haven't had the kind of infrastructures, etc., that they absolutely deserve as citizens of this country. But hey, hang on, Tony Blair, and I'm not a big fan of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown actually delivered some of this with their education policies, some of their absolutely genuine concern for how, you know, the economically divided and how privilege was not shared equally. So this was done. Boris just used it as one of his, oh, the world is going to be fantastic because we've left Europe. He never meant it. And I agree with Albie that to now turn this into an attack on Sunak is, again, totally politically illiterate. So I don't understand what they're talking. I know what they think they want to do, and it's a good. But why do they need to couch it in these terms?
Albie.
I don't think it was done. And I'm going to be going up to just outside of Manchester near Oldham tomorrow to go and visit my family up in the north. And I compare where I live in London, Chiswick, to Moseley, which is the place I'm going to tomorrow, and how Chiswick has changed in my lifetime and how Moseley has stayed the same, if not gotten worse in my lifetime. And I don't think there has been any government, whether it has been the Labour government or a Conservative government, that has truly delivered on the notion of levelling up. I don't think Blair did it any more than Johnson has done it. And I think the task will be, can there actually be a levelling up policy that delivers more than just rhetoric? Because at the moment, in my lifetime, over the last 30 years, I don't feel there has been any meaningful levelling up across this country at all. I don't think things are any better in the north of England today than they were in 1994 when I was born. So the task will be, can Starmer actually deliver in a way that, unfortunately, my party, the Conservatives, for the reasons that I mentioned before, COVID, Ukraine, Partygate, have not been able to?
No, sorry, Albie. You know, you're so young. It makes me cry when I think of how old I am. Um, but statistically, there's all this research, and I'm not coming at it as I've never been a member of the Labour Party, to show that Sure Start, for example, actually turned around the fortunes of many, many children in impoverished, non-aspirational families and areas. We also have evidence that poverty that has gone up higher in the last 14 years than in the previous 10 years. I mean, this is all research. You can look it up. So it's not true to say nothing was done and nothing was achieved. And for Gordon Brown, it was a real, deep, personal thing. And it never has been for, I think Michael Gove sometimes comes across as if it means a lot to him. But Boris was just mouthing off. He never meant any of it.
But Yasmin, doesn't this go to the heart of the issue about levelling up, which is that it's quite a vague term and you can define it in lots of different ways? I mean, probably what Albie was describing in a way is if you go to town centres in a lot of northern towns, yeah, they are pretty run down and they probably haven't improved since the 1990s. What you're describing is slightly different, which is kind of life chances and opportunities. Then you could look at the economic prospects and whether someone growing up in, say, I don't know, Wigan, who's ambitious, needs to move to somewhere like London or Manchester in order to get on in life, or whether they can have the same opportunities in a town like Wigan. It's quite a vague term, isn't it, Yasmin?
It is and it isn't. I think there's always been, I mean, good God, the Prime Minister of Israeli talked about two nations way back in the Victorian time. It has ever been thus in this country, and maybe in several other countries. There are three ways you do this. You change the culture, and family life, and sense of, change it from hopelessness to hope. You bring opportunity so that people can actually see that there is a future for us here. And then finally, it has to be sustained. It's not a 2-year job. I live in quite an affluent, not far from Albie. I was just saying to my husband, our central, it's Ealing, used to be a thriving place. It is dying. It is dying. All the shops are closing. Poverty is everywhere. So it's not only up north, but of course up north it's much worse. And what you do need is a hugely integrated program. Will Starmer deliver? I'm not sure. I think Rayner, who knows what it's like to be in this place, may bring something to it. But it's a hope.
That's a really good point you raise as well there, Yasmin, about, where you live in London doesn't mean that everything's fine and dandy in London by any stretch of the imagination. So often when we talk about levelling up, there's a focus on the north and on the Midlands. But, I'm from Bristol, and around Bristol, you go to Weston-super-Mare, for example, it is typical of many of the old Victorian seaside towns that have been left behind. And the poverty and the deprivation there is shocking very often. Even within a relatively prosperous city like Bristol, you have real pockets of deprivation. And Albie, do you think that's something that Labour need to do more to address if they do come in? It's all very well them talking about levelling up, but they need to understand the full extent and the nuances of this problem.
Well, of course they do. And at the moment, all they are doing is talking about levelling up. They're talking about a taking back control bill, which is very similar to something which the Conservatives have already done. They're talking about further devolution, which is already something very similar to what the Conservatives have already done. So again, I come back to my point. I'm just not really sure what Labour want to do about levelling up. I think it's all well and good to write in a centre-right paper, The Times, and try and win over some Tory voters to vote for the Labour Party. But no one really knows what they're voting for when it comes to the Labour Party. Dare I say, they don't have a plan. Rishi Sunak does have a plan. At least you know what you're getting with Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives.
It's very touching, this loyalty you're showing this hopeless man. Very touching. Oh, God, I hope he brings you in if he wins the next election, Albie. You seem to have more faith.
So what's Labour's plan then, Yasmin?
Sorry?
What's Labour's plan?
I'm not Labour.
Convince me to vote Labour.
I'm not Labour, but I'm sorry. This is Rishi Sunak is bombing even in his own party. He's got nothing to show for his time. And admittedly, he hasn't had that much time. But I'm sorry, this man does not even inspire his own party. How is he going to inspire the rest of us? So it's touching, your loyalty. Insane.
Lots more to come from the journalist and author Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and the political commentator Albie Amankona.